Get ready.
Virtual On is a franchise with a long history. The first game came out at the height of Sega's arcade dominance back in the 90s when it seemed like everything they released was certified gold. Created by Sega's AM3 division, who were responsible for other highly successful arcade games such as Sega Rally Championship and Crazy Taxi, Virtual On would go on to receive a number of sequels, but only the first 3 games came out in the arcade. These 3 games are what make up the Cyber Troopers Virtual On Masterpiece Collection, which was released all the way back in 2019 for the PS4 exclusively in Japan. You might think, given the name, that this is the premier collection of these games. And while there's plenty to like about it, it's far from the most feature-rich collection. I'm not even convinced this is the best way to play the first 3 games. That doesn't mean it's a complete failure, it does get quite a lot right, but a masterpiece? I don't think so. Okay, so before we get into the meat of this review, I just want to disclose that I am not great at these games. I know that there's a good chance that some of you are longtime Virtual On fans and are going to cringe at my pathetic newbie skills. So I just wanted to put that out there. I mean no disrespect with my crappy gameplay. Also, this review is going to focus on the quality of this collection rather than the games themselves, so I'm not going to talk about whether I think these are good games. I figure if you're watching this video, you probably already know what these games are about, and if you don't, and maybe you're just curious, this video will let you know if this is a good introduction to Virtual On. Now, as I said at the start, this collection only came out on the PS4 and was released exclusively in Japan. This is another one of those situations where it makes no sense why there wasn't a Western release. I mean, the only time you need to read Japanese is in some of the menus. The games themselves are in English, so I can't imagine that translating the rest of it would have required much effort. Also, it's not like there would be licensing issues, as this is an original IP, and there isn't any licensed music that would cause problems when moving to the West. The only thing I can think of is that maybe Sega, or Sega if you prefer, didn't think there would be much of an audience for it and didn't want to spend a dime on marketing. I get that, but also, I don't know. I feel like if they just chucked it on the PSN and put out a trailer, it would have sold itself. Anyway, the only way to purchase it legitimately is to have a Japanese PSN account and purchase store credits from somewhere like PlayAsia or eBay. Now, this isn't the hardest thing in the world to organize, but it's a hassle, and navigating the Japanese PSN store if you don't read Japanese is a chore. There wasn't a physical release as far as I can tell, so setting up a Japanese PSN account is really your only option unless you want to look into bootlegging. I'm certainly not advocating for that, but it might actually be easier. Sega, if you're listening, you could avoid conversations like this on piracy altogether if you just gave us a Western release. But I digress. So, like I said, this collection contains the first 3 games: 1996's Virtual On Cyber Troopers, 98's Cyber Troopers Virtual On Oratorio Tangram, and 2001's Cyber Troopers Virtual On Force. While the process of obtaining it might be complex, the presentation of this collection is incredibly straightforward. After you press start, you'll be presented with a basic menu that allows you to select a game. Selecting a game then takes you to the main menu for that game, and if you're familiar with the Sega Ages games on PS2, it's a very similar menu style. The options are more or less the same for every game with a few minor differences. The UI is pretty basic, but it's fast enough and the games launch with minimal loading, making it easy to fire up a match quickly. The performance across all 3 games is rock solid at what I'm guessing is 60 frames per second, and the gameplay has been preserved as much as is possible using a modern controller. I should mention that I'm playing this on a PS5, although I haven't seen any complaints during my research about the performance when playing on the PS4. Now, the controls certainly take a bit of getting used to. By default, the left stick is assigned to movement while the right is used to turn. You use the shoulder buttons for firing weapons, X is used for jump, and you have a few buttons you can hit for dash. I'm certainly not a Virtual On aficionado, but the stick layout feels a bit clunky. Thankfully, it is possible to set up a twin stick layout that mimics the arcade controls. It still takes some getting used to, but pulling both sticks outwards to jump feels more natural if you ask me. If you want the proper arcade experience, you'll want to get the Tanita twin stick. It'll set you back a cool $600 Australian, but according to all reports, it's the real deal. Along with a standard arcade mode and a training mode, all 3 games support online. This includes a variety of modes, such as ranked and custom matches. Fair warning though, if you thought the AI was hard, just wait until you experience 3 decades of Japanese whoop-ass. Unfortunately, this is the only way to play against other people because none of the games in this collection include local multiplayer. Okay, I wanted to briefly touch on each game. Now, finding information on this collection is difficult. The original press release from Sony says very little about content and features, and says nothing about things like frame rates and resolutions. So this is just my observations and assumptions based on my experience with this collection. The first game is a port of version 3.3, which is the original Model 2 arcade version, and also the one that was ported to the 360 and PS3. This is a no-frills straight-up port. It has a basic training mode, which is similar to the other home versions, where you can modify a few different settings. It also lets you select the arranged soundtrack, and that's it. It doesn't have split-screen multiplayer like the Saturn and PS2 ports, and there's no way to play as the bosses either. The version of Oratorio Tangram included is version 5.66, which is the final arcade revision. This version marked the switch to Sega's Naomi hardware, and it has better visuals, more characters, and VMU support. I'm pretty sure there's no way to hook up an actual VMU, this is simply handled with a regular save process. This game is very similar in gameplay style to the original, with a couple of tweaks to the formula, like the ability to dash after becoming airborne. I feel like the AI is even more challenging than the first game, or maybe I just suck more at this one. The version of Virtual On Force is 7.7, which again is the final arcade revision. This version is only a minor update, focusing on balance changes and bug fixes. It's my least favourite of the three games simply because I don't love the 2v2 format. It's also a much slower paced game. It would undoubtedly be more fun to play with someone of similar skill, and although that's technically possible, unless you know someone, it's pretty unlikely, for reasons that I'll get into shortly. It's easily the best looking of the first three games, and I think it benefits the most from the up-res graphics. All three games feel authentic to play, although there might just be a smidge of input latency. I've seen a couple of people on Reddit complaining of the same problem, but for the average player, I think it's low enough not to be an issue. It could potentially be irritating when played at a pro level, although this collection is played competitively. The Tanita Cup, for example, is a Japanese tournament that's held annually. And if you plan on playing online, you might want to check out some of the videos on YouTube to give you an idea what you're up against. Online still has players, which I gotta admit was a huge surprise. Remember, this collection is 4 years old at this point. I tested all three games and managed to consistently find matches in the first two. Virtual On Force was a bust though. Finding 4 players is undoubtedly more difficult, and I guess people don't love it as much as the others. And this is what I was talking about before. This game was really designed to be played with 3 other people, and playing against the AI just isn't that fun. Something else to bear in mind is that I live in Sydney, and the time difference between Sydney and Tokyo is only 2 hours. So if you're in the UK or the US, finding people to play with is likely going to be harder. The netcode in the matches that I've played has been great though. No lag, no dropouts, it just works. Again, the proximity to Japan undoubtedly helps, and given that the game was likely never intended to be played outside of Japan, your mileage may vary. It's pretty sweaty, but yeah, if you're interested in online, there are still matches being played. And if you want to test your skills against real people, then this collection provides that. Visually, the games are incredibly sharp. They all use flat shaded polygons, and upscaled to 1080p they look great. This low poly look has had a small resurgence in the past few years, and I think this has helped the visuals hold up by modern standards. It's not a flawless presentation though. In Virtual On Cybertroopers, some of the HUD elements and effects appear to be using a much lower resolution, which looks blurry and out of place. The other games thankfully don't suffer from this problem, and my guess is that's because they're based on the Xbox 360 ports of these games. I can't confirm this, like I said, information on this collection is incredibly limited. This is just an assumption based on the available modes and the presentation of the menus. There's no filter options in the display settings for any of the games either. I'm not really into scan lines or CRT filters, but I think you kind of need to include them in this type of collection. Plenty of people do like these display options, and it's just kind of the done thing. Each game does have a handful of basic display options, and I do mean basic. For example, in the original game, you can display the game at the normal size, a large size, which presumably stretches the pixels to fill the display, and there's also a full option, which stretches the image to fit a widescreen. And yeah, while it technically fills the entire screen, does anyone really want to play the game like this? I mean, would proper 16:9 support really have been too much to ask? Fundamentally, the games themselves look and sound great, and they run smoothly too. It's just disappointing that they're presented in almost exactly the same way as the 360 ports, albeit with less features. Now, it can't be understated how good they look at 1080p, even if some of the assets aren't razor sharp, but there was an opportunity here to go beyond. So no, I don't think this is the definitive collection of these games. From an authenticity point of view, then sure, for the most part they look and run as good as they did back in the arcade, arguably better in many ways. The problem is that this isn't the first time these games have come home, and most of the other ports offer more than this collection does. Take the original Virtual On. It was ported to a number of systems. The most well known is the Saturn port. It's the least arcade perfect, but it still manages to be a decent version considering what it's running on, and it has a ton of extras. There are PS2 ports of the first two games that also include a bunch of new features and content. The 360 port of Virtual On Force has local split-screen multiplayer, and if you bought the Collector's Edition, you got a booklet that documents 15 years of Virtual On history, a 6-disc soundtrack, and it came in a fancy box. So not only is this masterpiece collection only available as a download, none of these additional features or extra content have been included. I've said this before, but I strongly believe that these types of collections are an opportunity to preserve a game's legacy. Accurate representations of the games are important, but fans want more than that. We want to know how they got made, see some cool artwork, and have impressive looking objects to add to our collections for worship. You could argue that running on current hardware, these games have never looked better, and there's no denying that it's convenient having them all contained in one collection rather than separate installs. Being able to buy them at all is kind of a miracle, given that Sega has mostly let their back catalogue of incredible arcade bangers fade into obscurity, but it's impossible to ignore the lack of effort put into this supposed masterpiece collection. It actually has less content per game than the previous ports. Does that mean you shouldn't buy it though? Well, it depends. If you are hoping for something that improves on the previous ports by consolidating the best features and content into the one package, then this collection isn't for you. Like another recent collection of old games that comes to mind, it's not hard to imagine what could have been. Considering how popular Virtual On is, especially in Japan, and the huge amount of additional content they could have added, it feels like a missed opportunity. The lack of local multiplayer and features makes it a less attractive proposition for the casual audience, and for people looking to get into these games. Although, you could argue that Virtual On is pretty damn niche at this point, so maybe that doesn't matter. On the other hand, if you don't care about color editors and art galleries and you just want a convenient way to play these games, or a way to play them online, then yeah, for 4,500 yen, it's not a terrible deal. It's also the closest that you can get to the arcade experience without buying an arcade cabinet, and if your pockets are deep enough, in some ways it can be better. Finding other players online is still possible too, so one of the main attractions of this collection remains functional, which can't be said for loads of other collections, even at their launch. Samurai Showdown Collection. It's cool that it exists at all, and hopefully this isn't the last time that we see these games. Fingers crossed that next time there's a bit more fanfare, something physical for collectors, or at the very least a Western release.